You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is award-winning author Cate Green, whose novel The Curious Kidnapping of Nora W. won 2019's Exeter Novel Prize. The Curious Kidnapping of Nora W. focuses on the final 18 days, not of Nora's life, but before she breaks the world record for being the oldest person in history at 122 years and 165 days old. But strong-willed Nora is not your average centarian. And as she disappears from her retirement home, she and her family embark on an adventure down memory lane. Please allow me to introduce Cate Green, author of The Curious Kidnapping of Nora W. Hello, Cate. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm very excited to talk to you about this book, but before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so my name's Cate Green. I'm a journalist by initial training and early career. I worked when I was still living in England for the BBC and Channel 4, and I came to France some time ago to continue working in journalism for a news channel called Euronews, which is based in Lyon. And I did that for quite a few years. And since then, since I left there, I've been working as a communications consultant and as an interpreter. So I have many clients in all sorts of different industries and businesses, mostly in France.
Well, that jumps my next question, which was, what is your connection to France? Did you have a connection before the work connection? Was there a personal one?
No, my initial connection was work, but I have always been a Francophile. And I actually was very lucky to go to a primary school many, many years ago where they actually introduced French at the age of 8. So I've been learning French since I was 8. I absolutely loved it. I had this sort of light bulb moment when I was in primary school when we were shown some cartoons about a family in France. I only remember the girl's name was Babette. And I thought, oh my gosh, there are people who are like me, but they speak another language and they live in another country. And it was kind of like, yeah. And from then I just loved languages. I studied French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so I've been coming to France a lot. I lived in France briefly as a student. And yeah, it just was something that I'd always wanted to do. And so when this channel called Euronews opened, it seemed a perfect opportunity to combine my love of languages with my career in journalism. And I moved out to Lyon and expected to stay maybe a couple of years. And gosh, several decades later, actually, I'm still in Lyon, I'm still loving it. Yeah, so I've got a very, very strong connection to France. And I am actually French. I've been French now for about, I think it's 6 years. So definitely a strong French connection.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Merci.
I had a very similar but opposite introduction to French. I was in school and I remember watching a French cartoon as well. I just thought of this when you were saying it. But the one that it featured dancing pineapples. Oh. So all I got from it was the word ananas. Right. And my association with the French then was that they were sort of ridiculous. So it didn't work for me the same way that it worked.
And you might still think that. No, I didn't say that.
I mean, there are moments. So can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Of course, yes. So it's my debut novel, The Curious Kidnapping of Nora W. It was inspired by my late mother-in-law, who died about 5 years ago. She was a survivor of the ghettos in Poland, and then later of Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, the German concentration camps. And she died in her mid-90s. And I'd say in the 10 years or so before that, she had quite a series of minor and more major ailments, and she always seemed to just power through them with the help of the doctors, of course. And we sort of had this almost family joke that maybe she was indestructible, that she'd survived so many terrible things that she was just going to live forever. And so I had this idea inspired by that a Holocaust survivor would become the oldest person ever in the history of the world. As you probably know, the current record holder is a French woman called Jeanne Calment. And so I had this idea, that a Holocaust survivor would sort of take their own personal revenge on history and live forever almost. So that's the sort of basic premise. And the book, I've transposed the action to London. My late mother-in-law ran a grocery store with her husband in Montreal, Canada, which is where my husband is from. But since I'm British and I grew up around London, I transposed the action to London. And we meet Nora 18 days before her world record is going to happen. She's living in a care home, not very happy in her care home. She's a very strong, resilient woman, but quite cantankerous and stubborn. And her family want her to have this big party inviting the world record people, the Guinness World Record people. And she doesn't want that. So she actually, this is not a spoiler because it happens very early on, she actually does a runner, if you like, or a wheelchairer with one of her carers, her favorite carers, and disappears from the care home. And the book recounts what happens next. Do her family find her? What happens if and when they do? Will she make the 18 days? And so on and so forth. And I think it's important also to say that although the Holocaust does feature in the book, of course, it's really not a book about the war and the Holocaust. It's very much a book about surviving, building a good life after this sort of terrible, unthinkable horrors. Yeah, it's a book about how you go on to build your life after that sort of experience, I would say.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. It's an undercurrent. We know that that's something that has happened. There's a reference to the numbers, the tattoo on her arm, but it's not something that we spend a lot of time in. The book doesn't take a very super dark turn where, we're suddenly confronted with the Holocaust in any kind of shocking way.
That's right.
But it does obviously shape not only her life, but her whole family's life.
Definitely.
So the story is told through two main perspectives. We have Debs, who's Nora's great-granddaughter.
That's right, yes.
And then we have Arifa, who is Nora's caretaker.
Uh-huh.
How did you decide on these two characters as the storytellers?
Well, I definitely wanted in any case for Nora not to be the main storyteller because I felt that then I would be forced probably to talk more about her war experience. And also I felt it would be quite limiting because she's a very, very old lady. She's 122 and she is in a wheelchair. And so I kind of thought, that's going to be very limiting also in terms of place where we are going to be able to be during the narration. It's going to be quite... So I knew immediately that I wanted her great-granddaughter Debs to be one of the narrators. Possibly, I'm Jewish. I wasn't brought up in quite the same part of London that Debs comes from, but my mother was. And I don't know I think perhaps there was a bit of a connection with me. It's not at all autobiographical, but perhaps, that was what drew me to the character of Debs. And then Arifa, she came through as a character very quickly. She's a Syrian refugee and working in a care home. And that was an important point to me. But I hadn't seen her as a narrator. And I actually, when I started writing the book while I was on a retreat in southwest France, this incredible retreat called La Muse. And one of the other authors there, we would often go for walks at the end of the day to watch the sun go down and so on. And I was talking to her about it. And I knew that I wanted a second narrator. And I just couldn't see what it was going to be. And she said to me, "It's Arifa." And I said, "Oh, of course it's Arifa," and it really was, again, a light bulb moment that, she saw what I wasn't able to see. And when, and the sort of the clouds parted, I thought, of course it's Arifa. And it became really obvious from them that I needed to have Arifa's voice come through clearly. Yeah.
It does make sense after having read the whole book because you've got someone who's deeply embedded in the family and in the history, and then someone who's a little bit of an outsider with a different perspective.
Right, exactly. And who also, again, I don't want to give anything away, but who also, I've said she's a Syrian refugee, so there's a parallel in terms of a war experience. And for me, that was very important that we were talking about more of a universal theme than just the Jewish experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. We do read some passages from inside Nora's head, inside her brain. After having read them, I can also agree that to read a whole book like that would be quite dense, and also it would probably be quite a short, surrealist kind of book.
Yeah.
So we get to read how Nora is piecing her memories together, and she's 122, but she's not senile, but also she is 122.
Yes.
So sometimes the memories are a bit stream of consciousness. They go from one place to another. Were those passages difficult to write?
It's a good question. I don't think they were, actually. I think probably they were some of the easiest passages to write in the sense that they were quite finite and defined. They're sort of almost, they're not standalone scenes because they come in at certain points of the action that's taking place, but they're somewhat removed from the action because, as you say, she goes into her own head, there's stream of consciousness. So in a way, they were sort of like little nuggets. Because I think for me, one of the things that I find most challenging about writing a novel is the plot and is the sort of, the stitching together of how the action follows through and how one scene will lead into another or how one chapter will begin. That for me, I'm not, they always talk about plotters and pantsers, and I'm definitely more of a pantser. So I kind of know pretty much where I'm starting, where I'm ending, and a couple of things in the middle, and that's about it. So in a way, those sort of little scenes with Nora's memories were perhaps easier in some ways because, as I say, they were sort of self-contained. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about her not being senile, because the book actually began, well, I wouldn't say that, but I once wrote a short story about this woman, very different, but it was still the same idea about the world record. And I wrote that very much as someone who did have dementia. And I kind of toyed with the idea for the novel, but I realized that it would be so difficult to write and I think to read because it was very disjointed. And I think the short story is probably only about 1,500 words long or 2,000, I can't remember. So I found it was sustainable and I quite liked it. Didn't do anything with it, but I quite liked it. But I just thought, yeah, for me, that the fact that she's 122 and she doesn't have dementia is clearly, it's very unlikely. I mean, some people do live to almost that age or to that age. It has happened. But for me, there was a sort of a fable quality about it that I wanted her to be a bit of a larger than life figure. And she does have times, as you say, where her mind wanders, where she can't quite work certain things out. But I wanted, yes, of course, it's not likely that someone of 122 is as bright as Nora is. But for me, that was, part of the fiction and the sort of suspending of disbelief a little bit, which I think many books, ask the reader to do. And I hope the readers will go along with that and enjoy her for who she is.
I think she's sort of the linchpin. She's this very strong matriarch. So having her as someone who can still keep her whole lineage in line through a word or a look or, some kind of demand, I think it's compelling.
Thank you.
So you said that you're a pantser and you didn't know exactly how everything was going to be structured. So the structure of the book ultimately is that we sort of count down from the 18 days to this world record day. Did you toy with moving around when some of the events happened within that timeline?
I don't think I did, actually. I think I just, I had this idea, the thought of doing that structure fairly early on. There are some things that mainly I would say in the editing process, I was very lucky because I actually won a prize with the first 10,000 words of the book. And the judge of this prize, the Exeter Novel Prize, is now my agent. She's an agent.
Wow.
And yeah, so that was fantastic because I think one of the most difficult things when you're what they call an aspiring writer is that you're on your own and there's all sorts of offers of editorial support or courses you go on that all cost quite a lot of money. And I had, I'd never really followed courses, but I'd had a mentor and things like that. And to have my agent actually already working with me, because generally speaking, an agent will only pick you up once you've finished the book and then they help you shape it a bit more. But I was actually able to use her as a bit of a sounding board. So I think that also helped sort of channel things. And I didn't necessarily move things around that much. There are a couple of things, particularly with my editor, Charlotte, at One More Chapter, who, for example, the second chapter wasn't in the version that she signed me up for. So yeah, there were some things that shifted around, but I think the fact of having this 18-day countdown really did help me, deal with the fact that I'm a pantser and gave me some structure that I had to, respect. I think it was helpful.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may also enjoy my podcast, City of Muses, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Network. Each week, I chat with contemporary artists, poets, dancers, designers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their creativity comes from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So speaking of this 18 days and this counting down, in this time, these couple of weeks, 2.5 weeks, Nora goes on sort of a like, this is your life type journey where she visits some of the places that had been important to her when she was younger. How did you decide on these places, and did any of them change as you went along?
That's a great question. Some of them I think were really quite important, and I wanted them to begin with. As you know, Nora runs this shop called Henry's Fruit with Henry, her husband. She used to run the shop, obviously, when the novel is set. That was a long time ago. So that was really important, that she would go back to the shop, which in the book has now become a cafe, which actually exists. It's called the Quaker Street Cafe, and it exists on Quaker Street in London. It's not quite how I describe it, but it's a real place. So that was a really important one. The fact that she goes back to the synagogue where she used to go in the East End of London, that was something I really felt that I wanted to come in. And then there were others that came about really through research, because I was sort of looking for places that would have been important. I mean, I don't know how much you and your listeners know about the East End of London, but I wanted it to be set there initially mainly because it really was the part of London where the Jews came before the war. In fact, there were a lot of Jews who came who were in exile or refugees in the East End of London, and then after the war also. But it's also a part of London that has traditionally been very much a place where immigrants, refugees, or whatever it may be, the Huguenots in France, who were the Protestants who were persecuted in, I'm going to forget which century now, but I'm going to say the 18th century, they went to the East End of London. So that was sort of why I picked that part. And now there's many, many Indians and Bangladeshis there. So it was very much a place of refuge, I'd say. And so then when I was researching it, I mean, I know it a little bit. It's not a part of London that I've ever lived in. I discovered places, for example, there used to be a Yiddish language theatre called the Grand Palais, very French name, which features not as a theatre, but that is also now a shop, and it exists. And so that's in the book. So there were certain places like that. There's a school that Nora's son went to when he was a boy. So there's no action that takes place in the school as such, but that's a real school, that the gates still exist, and there's a cemetery that is a real cemetery. So I really wanted them to be places that are there, that, you know, people can go and see them if they want to. And some of them, yes. So some of them I knew that I needed to have them, and others, yeah, it was through my research. So I thought, oh gosh, yeah, that's a place that Nora would want to go to.
I love that. These passages were some of my favorites in the book. I think one of my very favorites was when Nora goes to Henry's fruit shop, you know, her old shop, and knowing that that was based on a real place too. I love that. It adds another dimension to the story. Yeah.
And the real shop in Montreal was called Henry's Fruit.
Okay.
My late father-in-law was called Henry or Heinrich, depending, or Chaim sometimes, as they always have these mix of, you know, Yiddish and Hebrew names. And yeah, they had a shop called Henry's Fruit in Montreal.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That passage was a very vivid one for me. So,
oh, thank you.
One of the things that struck me as I was reading and as the story progressed were the dynamics within Nora's family. A lot of the characters, especially the women, are rather critical and maybe cantankerous, maybe not the most immediately likable for us to latch onto. Mm-hmm. But when it comes down to it, we really get to see how deep and strong their bond is with one another. It is this deeply rooted sort of unshakable thing. Did you ever worry about creating characters that weren't immediately likable or that we might be suspicious of?
Yes, I did. I did. And if I'm honest, Debs, who is quite sharp and spiky, in my original version, she was sharper and spikier. She was actually possibly less likable than she is. And I loved her. And I knew that underneath was this, you know, was who Debs is. And I'm not going to talk about why, but that there's a big heart in there. And, you know, and I think also, going off at a bit of a tangent, I mean, it's a cliche, but as I say, I am Jewish. It's definitely not based on my mother. But there is in the Jewish culture this strong women, you know, it's not a matriarchy, but there is a strong thing. And the Jewish mother is a cliche. There's so many jokes about it. And, you know, I think there's a reality to that. I mean, certainly my late mother-in-law, definitely very feisty and definitely very much the matriarch. You know, what she said was, you know, you had to sit up and listen. So I really wanted to reflect that. I didn't want it to come across as a Jewish mother cliche, but I really do think, I mean, like all cliches, there's some truth, right? Otherwise they wouldn't turn into cliches. But yes, I did, you know, I mean, if I'm honest, my editor wanted, I mean, she definitely loved Debs and she didn't want to change her completely, but she did ask me to mellow her a bit because I think she was concerned that, people would just say, God, who is this woman, and stop reading. So yes, I mean, it is a risk, isn't it? But I'm really glad that as you said, you do, as you go along, understand what's underneath and what's at the heart of this, and that there is this very strong family bond. And I think, certainly I, as a reader, want to see characters develop and be shaped by internal, external events, whatever it may be during a novel. And I hope that's what the reader will take away, that, they're not necessarily completely different, but that what they show to other people, perhaps they're more able to show what they have inside them to the people around them and to the reader as the book goes along.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the people around Deb specifically that made me realize, okay, there's probably something more to her than just this, kind of controlling woman. And one of the other things that really struck me is that all of the couples, all the relationships that you mentioned in this book, they're all loving couples.
That's interesting. I actually hadn't really thought about that, to be honest with you, but you're right. Yes, you're right.
There's usually like a tension between a man and a woman, or someone's hiding something, but all of these couples are genuinely in love and supportive of one another.
Yeah, although I'd say that perhaps Deborah's parents are a bit, I think there is genuine love, but it's not the smoothest of relationships. But you're right. Ultimately, I mean, I think Deb's father is not with Sylvia still today just because he has to put up with her. I think there is something more going on. Yeah.
Yeah. There isn't this undercurrent of like despising one another or wishing they were apart or stabbing each other in the back, these little jabs. There's none of that,
Yeah, you're right. Interesting point.
It's not an overt thing. It just occurred to me as I was reading, especially the relationship between Debs and her husband. I was like, these are beautiful, lovely, loving relationships. Everyone has them, including Nora and Arifa.
Well, it's interesting because I hadn't seen it in that way, but you're absolutely right.
In many ways, I think this is a story about, as you said, it's a story about two refugees, Nora and Arifa, and the importance of family and the importance of family as history. How did you come to recognize the parallels in these two experiences, and were there ones that surprised you as you were writing?
Well, one thing I didn't want to do is to sort of make any comparison between the war experiences, because I think that's, not my place to do. And, and I still believe that the Holocaust was an event in history that probably has no real parallel, but there were definitely parallels in the personal experience, particularly once again after their flight from or rescue, whatever it may be. And in fact, the character Arifa was also inspired by two, in fact, real people. Quite a few years ago now, my husband and I, we decided at the time when the sort of, I suppose, the migrant crisis for people coming out of Syria was at its sort of height, that we really wanted to see if we could help in some way. And we decided to get in touch with a charity that was helping to find homes or temporary homes for people from Syria. And so we did that. And in fact, the first family that came wasn't from Syria. There was a family from Iran. And then we had a second family a little bit later from Syria. And there were the two mothers in these families, one with a very young child, one with a young adult child. I just found that they were they were all wonderful people in these families. We were very lucky. They're just incredible. But these two women had this strength also, this resilience, and this not in any way a sort of a martyrdom approach, but they were carrying so much. They were holding their families together, being the glue, being the force that really kept them going. And there's a brief author's note before the book starts, which mentions that. And the thing that one of the things I really took from them is they always seem to be smiling. And, that's not because they were glib. I mean, I don't know how they did it. I really don't. They went through the most appalling things, both before they left their own country and certainly in the case of the Iranian family afterwards. And they were just able to keep this inner strength and, it's difficult to say enjoyment of life because they were still in a difficult situation, but they did. They enjoyed what they had of their life and were determined to try to move forward and, hoping that one day they would be able to see the rest of their family. I don't think either of them really hope that they'll be able to go back home. And I just found it so powerful and so inspiring in my own life that I wanted to tell that story and say, It's still going on, guys. I mean, it's not the same as the Holocaust, okay? We agree, but it's still going on. These people who are coming across in these boats and who are drowning and who are facing all sorts of horrible things along the way. I mean, yeah, I don't want to get into a political interview. Obviously, that's not the point. The world just does seem to have forgotten. It hasn't forgotten the Holocaust, but it does seem to just not be able to accept that these are not people who are leaving because they think the welfare system is better. They're leaving their homes because their homes have been destroyed, or because they've had the police, in the case of the Iranians, the religious police. And, it's not a joke, it's not just, I'm sure we can do better. The French are so generous, or the British is,
Right.
As I say, I don't want it to be political, but yeah, there is a political point in my novel. I am trying to say, we are all humans, and we all have lives and things in our lives that are important to us, and we don't give up gladly or easily. And we do have to, people who've been through those sorts of things anyway, and many other people in different ways, we do have to sort of try and do the best with what we've got and what we have left. And that's really what was behind. And I think that's why it was so obvious once I realized that Arifa had to tell her story and share in Nora's story. I mean, it's not, Arifa does tell her story in snippets, which are mostly also not the same as Nora's, but in snippets, in that you see what's going on in her thoughts about, the life she's left behind and so on. And yeah, I just really felt that with what's going on today in the world, that I wanted to say, let's understand that these are human beings. That's really, I think, the most fundamental thing. These are human beings with emotions, with families, with lives, with loves, with difficulties. And yeah, we're all human beings, basically, aren't we? That's kind of the bottom line.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think you did real justice to both of these characters, to both of these stories, and to the people that they represent.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, if I have, then I've done my job.
So I have a bonus question for you that's far less heavy. So food plays an enormous role in this book, as it does in these two cultures. So I wanted to ask you, which of the foods that are mentioned in the book are your favorites? Oh. And are you such a fan of herring?
Oh God, no, I'm not. Actually, I do quite like it. As I say, I am Jewish, but I was brought up very much in a pretty secular Jewish family, and we didn't keep kosher, and occasionally we would have some of these foods. Like my grandmother used to make gefilte fish, which I hated and still do. But we never had the schmaltz herring, which Nora loves, although my husband absolutely adores it. And I do like it. I mean, I'm not as obsessed by it as he is. And yeah, a lot of the Jewish food, like the chopped liver, the gefilte fish, I'm not that big a fan. Chicken soup, of course, I love. I mean, who doesn't? And I'm sure it does cure all sorts of ailments. I love the honey cake, and that's partly based on my mother's honey cake recipe, which is delicious. I recommend it. Can send you the recipe if you like. And so then on Arifa's side, I'm less familiar with the Middle East. Well, it's not so much Middle Eastern, I suppose Levantine, I think is what you would call it. So the metzeh and the kibbeh, and but again, that was also partly based on the food that sometimes the families that stayed with us and who were good friends prepared for us. I mean, the metzeh is something I think we're probably all quite familiar with, the hummus and so on. And the tea, the hibiscus flower tea is delicious.
It sounds lovely.
So yeah, so there were definitely some things that I'd sampled and others that just, make me shudder when I think of it. It's funny, actually, just for la petite histoire, as they say, there are quite this rivalry in gefilte fish. My grandmother used to make this gefilte fish, which was sort of more or less little sort of balls of chopped fish, but you could see that it was fish, and it was almost like, herring chopped up sort of thing with a slice of carrot on the top. And then in my mother-in-law's tradition, they make this even worse, in my opinion, gefilte fish, which is sort of like it's cooked and chopped. It's very finely chopped. You don't see any pieces of fish, and it's kind of sweet. I mean, I don't know if you can imagine sweet fish balls.
I've had that one, yeah.
Have you? I'm not a fan at all. So it was fun for me to play around with that and write about that. But yeah, there is some I liked, some less.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, Molly on a Trip, Music Around Paris, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network. Molly sits down with local French artists or touring musicians from all over the world to talk about what's going on in their careers and what inspires them. Get insights into what these musicians love most about Paris. Check out Molly on a Trip, Music Around Paris now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I think it would be great if we could hear a little bit from the story.
Sure, with pleasure, yeah.
Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you read for us?
I don't think so. I thought I would read just some of the first pages of the novel because I don't want to give anything away. And I think probably, the people who've listened to the interview, I've probably given enough context for it to be clear. So the first few pages of chapter 1 is what I thought I would read.
Perfect.
Chapter 1, 18 days and counting, morning. My great-grandmother has only 18 days to go. There's no need for alarm, though. The doctors have not predicted her precise date of death, nor has she threatened hypergeriatric suicide on that specific date. No, in 18 days' time, she will become the world's oldest person ever. Nora Wojnawski was born on 10th of November 1896, and if she makes it to the 24th of April 2018, and her doctors are confident, she will be 122 years and 165 days old, thus demolishing the record set by Jeanne Calment, who was born in Arles in romantic Provençal France and died there too in August 1997. The records state that in 1888, Mademoiselle Calment was the last living person to have knowingly met Vincent van Gogh. The story goes that he came to her father's shop 100 years before to buy canvas for his paintings, and that our 13-year-old Jeanne found him particularly ugly. At the time, nobody thought to ask the hideous painter customer to pay for his supplies in artworks. But since Mademoiselle married into money, she had little, if any, regrets on that score. These are just a few facts that differentiate Jeanne Calment, currently the oldest person the world has ever seen, from my great-grandmother. Nora, known to her intimates as Nora, and to all her grand, great-grand, and great-great-grandchildren as our traditional Yiddisher Bubby, was born in Łódź, Poland, in the relatively carefree days before the 2 world wars. Less romantic than Provence, you will agree. It seems certain that she will die in Pinner, Middlesex, since that is where she now resides, in the Cedars Care Home, conveniently located on the Metropolitan line with fast trains into central London and not a majestic conifer in sight. As far as we know, she has never met any world-famous painters, living or dead, although Elton John did come to the Cedars for her 120th birthday celebrations. Wikipedia notes that Elton, aka Reginald Kenneth Dwight, was born and raised in Pinner. He sang the rather inappropriate Candle in the Wind. I suppose he was thinking of all the ones on the cake. A little less than 100 years and 1,000 miles separate Nora from Łódź today, and her life has been at least as full as Jeanne Calment's, if rather less sheltered, although much of that is another story entirely. A further important difference between these two supremely senior citizens is that my great-grandmother did not marry well. By that, I don't mean, as her remaining family apparently believed, that my great-grandfather was a good-for-nothing, rather that he had little or no pockets, let alone any zlotys left when he arrived in Britain fresh from the war, and failed to earn much more than a pittance in the grocery that he and his wife ran just off Brick Lane, until retiring to the flat above the shop. Henry's Fruit, as it was called, is now a trendy street art cafe rumoured by some to belong to Banksy. Money was certainly scarce back then, but these days there is uncertainty, not to say speculation, among her great-grand and even great-great-grandchildren about just how much we all stand to inherit, if and when mortality finally catches up with the apparently indestructible Nora. An old miser is how my mother has been known to describe her, but then she's always claimed the Wojnawski side of the family welcomed her with less than open arms. Careful, Bubby would say. Careful enough for the happy couple to put their hard-earned savings to one side, to buy a rental flat here, a rental flat there, so she must have cashed in big time thanks to the East End of London's soaring property prices when, several years after Henry's death, the family gently suggested she sell up and move to the Cedars. And that makes the guess how many zeros game even more of a puzzle. I'm not going to lie, the pound signs have occasionally been known to flash across my mind. But Bubby is Bubby, and I love her from the top of her bald head to her tired old toes. I, for one, would be happy for her to keep us all guessing until her great-greats have produced their own heirs to any possible fortune, which is one of the reasons that I was the natural choice as the family's Guinness Book of Records party organizer-in-chief.
Perfect. Thank you. So what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
Listen, I have a contract to write a second book, and I'm just getting started with it, to be honest with you. It's been a little bit, I had an idea. I'd started writing a book. I'd discussed it with my editor and my agent, and we were all kind of happy that this was the book that was going to work. And a couple of weeks ago, I was going through it, and I just thought, I just don't think this is the book to follow up from Nora and Co. So I've actually kind of gone back to the drawing board, which was a bit scary. But I'm very lucky because I have a very supportive editor who's not putting any pressure in terms of deadlines and so on. So I'm afraid it's going to have to watch this space. There's going to be another one coming, but I'm not quite sure. I can't give any clues really yet as to what I do know, but I can't tell you, is pretty much who the central character is going to be. And it's going to be also somebody larger than life. I think that's quite important to, respect Nora, that we have somebody who won't be at all the same, but that's going to be a big personality.
All right, that's exciting. So if we do want to watch this space, where can people find you?
Okay, so listen, I'm on Twitter quite a lot. You can find me there. What am I called on there? I'm called Sarah Cate Green. You can find me on Instagram, Cate Green Writes. You will soon be able to find me on my website, which will be categreen.co.uk. And where else can you find me? Facebook, Cate Green on Facebook. So please, I would love to meet anybody who would like to get in touch. That would be great.
Fabulous. And I'll include links to all of that in the show notes so that people can get to you really easily.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. It was wonderful speaking with you.
It was great to talk to you as well, Jennifer. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you again to Cate Green for such an interesting conversation. You can find Kate on Twitter at Sarah Cate Green, on Instagram at Cate Green Writes, on Facebook at Cate Green, and on her website, categreen.co.uk. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with New York Times bestselling author Madeline Martin about her novel, The Keeper of Hidden Books. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite authors who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.